In the 1960s, Pakistan's economy was growing at 6.8% a year. At the time, that rate outpaced India and made Pakistan the wealthiest country per capita in South Asia. By 2023, the situation had severely reversed. Inflation hit 38%, and the rupee lost half of its value against the US dollar in just 2 years. It is tempting to point to recent events like the global pandemic or the devastating 2022 floods as the main culprits for this collapse. But those events only stressed an already fractured system. Over the last few decades, Pakistan has entered into 11 separate agreements with the International Monetary Fund just to keep its economy afloat. Pakistan is trapped in a self-perpetuating economic loop. Escaping it means dismantling 3 specific, interconnected structural hurdles. This line chart tracks Pakistan's population over the last half-century. In 50 years, the number of citizens has quadrupled. When we break that population down by age, as seen in this demographic pyramid, we find that 36% of the country is under the age of 15. That creates a massive base of dependents who rely on a proportionally smaller group of working adults. This comparative bar chart shows what happens to a country's domestic savings when families have to spend almost everything they earn just to support their dependents. Pakistan's savings rate sits at barely 1/5 of what we see in neighboring countries like India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. That earning potential is restricted even further by a formal female labor force participation rate of just 20%, leaving massive economic capability untapped. Without a high ratio of working-age adults generating domestic savings, Pakistan is starved of the internal capital it needs to invest in its own industries. When domestic investment dries up, manufacturing facilities age and fall behind global standards. As a result, the economy relies heavily on exporting low-technology primary goods, like raw cotton and basic textiles, which command lower prices globally. At the same time, the country has to import expensive, high-value goods, particularly heavy capital equipment and refined petroleum, just to keep its infrastructure running. This flow visualization maps out the mathematical gap that forms when a nation spends vastly more on imports than it earns from exports. Economists call this gap the current account deficit. Looking at the trend line here, we see how this deficit is usually covered. Foreign direct investment typically plugs the gap, but years of political instability and security concerns drove that investment down from $8 billion in 2007 to just $3.5 billion in 2022. With a massive trade deficit and disappearing foreign investment, the burden falls entirely on the Pakistani government to find the cash necessary to keep the nation running. To fund that external shortfall, the government has to turn inward and rely on domestic taxation. But the tax system captures only half its potential base. Massive sectors of the economy, particularly retail and agriculture, contribute almost nothing in income taxes. Without sufficient tax revenue coming in, the government is forced into extreme levels of domestic and foreign borrowing to maintain daily operations. This pie chart of total government revenue reveals the most crippling metric of the crisis. Roughly 60% of all the money the government collects goes entirely toward paying the interest on that existing debt. As the remaining slice fractures into thin slivers, we see exactly what is left over. There is practically no budget remaining to invest in critical growth drivers like infrastructure, healthcare, or education. This completes the causal loop. Demographic burdens prevent savings, leading to trade deficits, which force government borrowing. The resulting debt consumes the revenue, triggering IMF bailouts and austerity measures that stifle the exact growth needed to pay the debt back. Securing a debt rollover with the IMF does not solve this loop. It merely hits the pause button on the macroeconomic crisis, leaving the daily pressures on households exactly the same. Breaking the cycle starts with steadily broadening the tax net to increase revenue by 3% of GDP over the next 5 years. At the same time, the government has to remove the bureaucratic red tape strangling small and medium enterprises, a sector that currently drives 30% of the national GDP. Another structural fix is adopting a circular economy framework to reduce reliance on imported raw materials. For example, producing aluminum from recycled sources requires 95% less energy than processing raw ore. Embracing practices like this slashes both the cost of the materials and the imported fuel needed to process them. Ultimately, the long-term solution requires investing heavily in family planning and female education. Slowing population growth increases the ratio of working-age adults, creating the demographic shift needed to finally build domestic savings. True economic sovereignty will not come from another round of international borrowing. It depends entirely on empowering the workforce